Chapter 23. Into Hiding. In the spring of 1841, when Joseph was harassed by the threat of extradition to Missouri, he had said some bitter things. No scribe had recorded the speech in which he called down curses upon his persecutors, but the rumor got about that he had predicted that the hated Boggs would meet a violent death within a year, and that Governor Carlin would die in a ditch. When, therefore, in May 1842, word came to Nauvoo that Boggs had been shot by an unknown assailant, it went through the city as if a great prophecy had been fulfilled. A writer in the Wasp, who signed himself Vortex, commented indiscreetly on May 28, "Boggs is undoubtedly killed according to the report, but who did the noble deed remains to be found out." Certain observers in Nauvoo noted that Joseph's sinister bodyguard, Porter Rockwell, who had been absent for some weeks, returned to the city just 2 days after the news of the shooting. He admitted to friends that he had just come from Missouri. The Whig press, knowing the zeal of some of Joseph's men for making his prophecies come true, was quick to point the finger of suspicion and insinuated that Joseph was behind the assault. "The Mormon prophet," said the Quincy Whig on May 21, "as we understand, prophesied a year or so ago his death by violent means, hence there is plenty of foundation for rumor." Joseph replied indignantly in the Wasp on May 28, "Boggs was a candidate for the same state senate, and, I presume, fell by the hands of a political opponent, with his hands and face yet dripping with the blood of murder. But he died not through my instrumentality. My hands are clean and my heart pure from the blood of all men." John C. Bennett wrote that he had heard the prophet offer a $500 reward to any destroying angel who could kill Boggs. At first, Bennett said he had been certain that Porter Rockwell had been the assailant, for before his trip to Missouri he had been abjectly poor, and after his return he had an elegant carriage and horses at his disposal, and his pockets were filled with gold. But Joseph had insisted, Bennett continued, that the carriage and gold were furnished Rockwell to haul tourists to and from the steamboat to the temple. "The destroying angel has done the work as I predicted," the prophet said, "but Rockwell was not the man who was shot. The angel did it." Bennett was not content with accusing the prophet in print. Boggs had obstinately refused to die, though he had been hit 3 times in the head. As soon as he had sufficiently recovered, Bennett went to him with all that he knew and more that he imagined about the attempted assassination. Boggs promptly swore to an affidavit charging Joseph with being an accessory before the fact of the intended murder, and persuaded Governor Reynolds to ask for his extradition on the ground that he was a fugitive from justice. When the sheriffs arrived in Nauvoo on August 8, 1842, armed with the writ and a warrant from Governor Carlin, both Joseph and Porter Rockwell submitted to arrest, but were released under a writ of habeas corpus issued by the Nauvoo Municipal Court. The city council then passed an ordinance giving the Nauvoo court power to inquire into the validity and legality of every writ or process served upon a Nauvoo citizen, and the right to dismiss it if the writ or process was found to have been issued either through private pique, malicious intent, or religious persecution, falsehood, or misrepresentation. Faced with this ordinance, which was an obvious infringement upon the powers of the state courts, the Missouri sheriffs went back to Governor Carlin for further instructions. Joseph had 1,000 witnesses to prove that he had been in Nauvoo on the day of the shooting, but he was certain that extradition to Missouri meant death. That he had no faith in the legality of the ordinance and used it only as a ruse to escape arrest, the sheriffs discovered upon their return, for Rockwell had secretly departed for Philadelphia, and Joseph had gone into hiding close to Nauvoo. For 4 months, the prophet lived the uncertain, nerve-shattering existence of a fugitive from justice with a handsome price upon his head. He hid in many places, from the secret bricked-in vault under the cellar steps of his home to the farm of a friend 2 days' journey north of Nauvoo. He usually traveled by skiff up and down the river at night, often landing for a time on an island to baffle possible pursuers. His friends launched rumors that he had gone to Washington, to Wisconsin, and even to Europe, but the sheriffs nevertheless made repeated visits to the city hoping to catch him in one of his rare visits home. When he first went into hiding, Joseph sank into a pit of depression that threatened to suffocate him. He thought much about death and that half-pleasant, half-grisly imagery that a young man associates with the grave, and planned an elaborate tomb on the river bank, which, he wrote in his journal, must be called the Tomb of Joseph, a descendant of Jacob. Solitude and foreboding did not turn him to introspection, however, although he submerged himself in his letters and journal, there was no self-communing, only rhetorical lament. O Lord, my heavenly Father, shall it be vain that thy servant must needs be exiled from the midst of his friends, or be dragged from their bosoms, to clank in cold and iron chains, to be thrust within the dreary prison walls, to spend days of sorrow and of grief and misery there by the hands of an infuriated, incensed, and infatuated foe, to glut their infernal and insatiable desire upon innocent blood, and for no other cause on the part of thy servant than for the defense of innocence, and thou, a just God, will not hear his cry? Oh no, thou wilt hear me, a child of woe. Mine enemies shall not prevail. They shall all melt like wax before thy face. Emma's first visit was a great comfort to him. The Bennett expose had been a paralyzing shock to her, and he had not been sure what she would turn to in his absence. How glorious were my feelings, he wrote in his journal, when I met that faithful and friendly band on the night of the 11th on Thursday, on the island at the mouth of the slough, between Sarah Hemla and Nauvoo. With what unspeakable delight, and what transports of joy swelled my bosom when I took by the hand on that night my beloved Emma, that was my wife, even the wife of my youth, and the choice of my heart. Many were the reverberations of my mind when I contemplated for a moment that many scenes we had been called to pass through, the fatigues and the toils, the sorrows and sufferings, and the joys and consolations from time to time, which had strewed our paths and crowned our board. Oh, what a commingling of thought filled my mind for the moment. Again she is here, even in the seventh trouble, undaunted, firm, and unwavering, unchangeable, affectionate Emma. Emma was always first with Joseph, a steady, monumental presence against which all the other wives were but lights and shadows. He accorded her what he believed to be all the rights of her position, complete domination of the children and home, and even trusted her to transact considerable business for him. Occasionally he deferred to her in matters of decorum and propriety, but his affection now was largely nostalgic. It was the wife of his youth to whom he paid his own special kind of devotion. As an intellectual companion, she did not exist for him, nor did any woman. One of Joseph's rare references to Emma in his journal is as revealing of this as it is of the prophet's vanity. When she was serving dinner to him and Parley Pratt one day, he complained jocularly that she always loaded the table with too much good food. When Pratt suggested that he eat by himself like Napoleon, seated at a table with just the victuals he needed, Emma spoke up quickly. "But Mr. Smith is a bigger man than Bonaparte. He can never eat without his friends." Joseph looked up at her in pleased surprise. "That," he said, "is the wisest thing I ever heard you say." Exactly what happened between them when Bennett's letters first appeared one cannot know, but it is clear that she set herself determinedly against any intimation of her husband's disloyalty. She demanded denials, and got them. To these she clung with a desperate tenacity, for Emma was ridden with the helpless jealousy that comes to a woman growing unlovely with illness and childbearing while her husband remains maddeningly young. And she was proud. The thought of her sons growing up to discover one day that their father, for all his strange genius and spiritual insight, was a common libertine, for she never could see a polygamist as anything else, was so nauseating that she thrust it from her and for a long time closed her eyes to what she dared not see. While Joseph was in hiding, she must have found some measure of content despite her terror lest he be captured, for their visits were frequent, and he wrote her tender and affectionate letters. She could not know that during the weeks he stayed in hiding at the farm of Edward Sayers, he persuaded Mrs. Sayers to join his circle of wives. With the approach of winter, Joseph's maneuvering in and out of Nauvoo became increasingly difficult. He toyed with the idea of going to Wisconsin, but dismissed it after the inauguration of Thomas Ford as governor on December 8, 1842. Ford believed that Missouri writ for Joseph's extradition was illegal, and agreed to test it formally in an Illinois court if Joseph would give himself up for trial. Emma was now desperately ill, about to give birth to her 8th child, and the prophet was willing to risk anything for a little security. As soon as the baby came and he knew that Emma would recover, he said that he would give himself up to the law. The boy was born the day after Christmas, 1842, and died almost immediately, since Emma had never really ceased grieving after the bright-eyed little Don Carlos, and Joseph had prayed that the new baby would still her lament. The death was doubly bitter. Of her 8 children, only 3 had lived, and Emma felt cheated in her motherhood. Before leaving for Springfield, Joseph called at a neighbor's house where there were twin baby girls and said to the mother, "Sister McIntyre, I have come to borrow one of your babies. I want her for my wife to comfort her for a time." The baby was taken to Joseph's home by day, and at night he was returned to her mother, and in nursing this child Emma was freed of some of her desolation. Joseph, meanwhile, submitted to arrest and set forth for Springfield with a retinue of 40 of his best soldiers armed to the hilt with bright muskets and brighter bayonets. They stopped for the night in the village of Paris, only to be denied lodging at every inn they visited. Joseph argued good-naturedly at first and then pleaded in deadly earnest, for a prairie gale was whipping through the streets, chilling his men to the marrow and biting their fingers and faces with frost. Suspecting finally that the tavern owners had leagued together in agreement to bar them, he insisted harshly, his face livid. "We must and will stay, let the consequence be what it might, for we must stay or perish." The landlord replied sullenly, "We have heard the Mormons are very bad people, and the inhabitants of Paris have combined not to have anything to do with them." "We will stay," the prophet repeated in a tone that made the man turn pale, "but no thanks to you. I have men enough to take the town, and if we must freeze, we will freeze by the burning of these houses." The taverns were promptly opened. The company marched into Springfield the next day in a slow and solemn parade that caused a sensation among the citizens. "All were astounded at the course of the prophet in giving himself up," said one newspaper man, "knowing full well that if the Missourians got a hold of him, he would be gibbeted." "The prophet is a large, portly, and fine-looking man," the writer continued, 6 feet without shoes, looks about 40 or 42, and weighs 220 pounds, eyes light blue, approaching to gray, light brown hair, peaked nose, large head. I think a very little self-esteem, but more of the intellectual than the animal. Dressed in box coat, black blue dress coat and pants, black silk velvet vest, white cravat, a large gold ring on the finger next to the little one of his left hand, black cane, and wears a continual smile on his countenance. Although technically under arrest, Joseph had complete freedom in the city and met the leading figures in the Illinois state government. His youth, affability, and distinguished appearance won the grudging admiration even of the Whig Party leaders, and the trial was rapidly transformed into a personal triumph. On New Year's Day, the House of Representatives was thrown open to Orson Hyde for a sermon on Mormonism, and Joseph was showered with invitations. James Adams, judge of the probate court of the Sangamon County, who had long had an affection for Joseph and eventually was baptized into the church, insisted on his staying in his own home, though he had no other bed to offer than the living room sofa. He liked questioning this astonishing young man on everything from his principles of marriage to the state of the millennium, and applauded warmly when Joseph prophesied in the name of the Lord that he would not go to Missouri, dead or alive. When the decision was read on January 5, 1843, the courtroom was crowded to the eaves. Judge Pope entered from the rear, accompanied by half-dozen ladies whom he smilingly permitted to sit on the stand beside him. This good-humored mockery of the defendant was not lost on the crowd, which was as interested in the prophet's marital history as in his legal embarrassment. "This case," the judge began after some preliminaries, "presents the important question arising under the Constitution and laws of the United States, whether a citizen of the state of Illinois can be transported from his own state to the state of Missouri, to be there tried for a crime, which, if he ever committed, was committed in the state of Illinois, whether he can be transported to Missouri as a fugitive from justice, and when he has never fled from that state." After a lengthy recital of the arguments, which revolved chiefly around the Boggs affidavit, the judge held the writ invalid and ordered Joseph discharged. The decision surprised no one. The prophet and his men went back to Nauvoo jubilant. John "Skunk" Bennett, as he was now popularly called, had done his worst, and Joseph had come off triumphant. In a great Thanksgiving celebration, he served a feast to 50 of his choicest friends. As a gesture of loyalty and humility, Emma and Joseph served the guests themselves, and the men and the women accepted the food and drink as if it were a sacrament. When the meal was over, Joseph announced that he and Emma had been married 15 years to the day, whereupon there descended upon the couple such a hail of good wishes that they stood speechless with emotion. Emma must have felt vindicated at last from the aspersions of John Bennett, although, had she been in a mood for suspicion, the presence of Eliza Snow and Hannah Ells might very well have robbed her of some of the sweetness of this moment. If Joseph was cleared from involvement in the Boggs shooting, Porter Rockwell was not. He remained all winter in Philadelphia lonely and penniless. Finally, he decided to risk a return to Nauvoo, and with brazen insouciance got off the steamboat at St. Louis for a look around the city. He was recognized, caught, and taken to prison in Independence. The most damaging of evidence against him was Bennett's charge that Rockwell had said to him on July 5, 1842, "If I shot Boggs, they have got to prove it. I never done an act in my life that I was ashamed of, and I do not fear to go anywhere that I have ever been, for I have done nothing criminal." This was flimsy evidence upon which to hang a man, and let it be said to the credit of the Missouri courts that they found it wanting. Although Rockwell was kept in prison 9 months, part of the time in irons, he was eventually released. However, Rockwell may have been guilty, for he later boasted of Boggs' shooting, and his subsequent career as a henchman for Brigham Young did not exactly establish a reputation for innocuousness, but whether Joseph ordered the deed will always be debatable. Certainly he had nothing to gain by it but trouble. Since Boggs was no longer in power, there could have been no serious motive but revenge, and Joseph was not a vengeful man. If he dispatched Rockwell to fulfill his own prophecy, he must then likewise have planned the murder of Thomas Carlin, and the twin deeds would have been an invitation to the destruction of his whole people. But Joseph seemed content to christen one of his horses Tom Carlin and joke about riding the governor whenever he wanted to provoke a grin. Yet it should be noted that Joseph H. Jackson, one of the less savory characters Joseph Smith had in his employ for a time, confessed that the prophet in 1843 had offered him $3,000 to release Porter and kill old Boggs. And William Law, second counselor to Joseph in the Nauvoo years, in his old age swore to an affidavit that said in part, "Joseph told me that he sent a man to kill Governor Boggs of Missouri. The fellow shot the governor in his own house." This he later repeated in an interview with W. Will. "Let me tell you that Joe Smith told me the fact himself. The words were substantially like this. I sent Rockwell to kill Boggs, but he missed him. It was a failure. He wounded him instead of sending him to hell." Bennett and Jackson are unreliable witnesses, to say the least, but Law was a man of integrity. Since it is odd that he waited 40 years to accuse Joseph of inciting the Boggs shooting, since he laid many other crimes at the prophet's door when he left the church in 1844. It is possible, of course, that Bennett and Jackson's accusations were pure fabrication, and Law's two statements merely a distortion of memory built up through years of bitter feelings against the church. If so, it is still not difficult to understand Rockwell's motivation for the crime. As literal-minded as Brigham Young, he might easily have reasoned that fulfilling Joseph's prophecies should be the business of the saints, since the Lord cannot always be depended upon to hurl thunderbolts with the necessary precision, or he may simply have taken it upon himself to avenge the Mormon wrongs, regarding it as a public service. Perhaps he was out of favor and hoped to reinstate himself. At any rate, he received no censure. When he returned to Nauvoo in December 1843, Rockwell was a frightening apparition. His hair hung down to his shoulders, black and stringy like a witch's. His clothes were filthy and tattered, his shoes in shreds. It was night when he rode across the river, and he went directly to Joseph's sumptuous new home, the Mansion House, where a dancing party was in progress. With a keen relish for practical jokes, Rockwell pushed his way past the guard with an oath and made for the prophet, muttering imprecations and pretending to be drunk. Taking him for a Missourian, Joseph began to scuffle with him and was ready to pitch him headlong out into the night when he got a good look at the man's face. "It's Porter!" he shouted, and began thumping him on the back with joy. The women stopped screaming, the guards put away their bowie knives, and Rockwell became the lion of the evening. Laughing at his long hair, Joseph promised him that if he kept it long like Samson and lived faithful to the church, his enemies should have no power over him. Accepting this promise as the Lord's word, Porter heeded it to the end of his life. Joseph had not been long in the mansion house before he transformed it into a hotel, for he was weary of entertaining at his own expense a never-ending stream of curiosity seekers. His own family occupied spacious upstairs quarters, and the huge living room below was turned into a lobby and dining hall. Some weeks after Rockwell's return, Emma went to St. Louis to purchase furnishings. She returned to find in one corner of the lobby a well-equipped bar, with Rockwell, his hair neatly braided and tied with a ribbon, polishing glasses and dispensing whiskey. "Joseph, what is the meaning of that bar in this house?" she cried with a passion that startled her oldest son, who had never heard his parents quarrel. Joseph was ready with arguments. Porter was penniless. He deserved much consideration for his 9 months in a Missouri jail. His acquittal was of immeasurable aid to them all. Moreover, the bar was temporary and would be transferred to the barber shop when under construction across the street. "How does it look," she asked witheringly, "for the spiritual head of a religious body to be keeping a hotel which has a room fitted out as a liquor-selling establishment?" He reminded her that all taverns had bars, and while it was true that no grog shops were permitted in Nauvoo, there must be some place where distinguished travelers could be permitted the refreshment to which they were accustomed. The Nauvoo City Council had passed an ordinance giving him the sole right to dispense liquor in his hotel, and who better could be trusted with such a monopoly? "Well, Joseph," Emma said quietly when she had heard him through, "the furniture and other goods I have purchased for the house will come, and you can have some other person look after things here. As for me, I will take my children and go across to the old house and stay there, for I will not have them raised up under such conditions as this arrangement imposes upon us, nor have them mingle with the same kind of men who frequent such a place. You are at liberty to make your choice. Either that bar goes out of the house, or we will." "Very well, Emma," Joseph answered immediately. "I will have it removed at once." And he did.